So this is about, it's a kind of an overview initially, and some questions that I've had for a long time about the history of the book as a discipline, as it's emerged in the last sort of, really as a discipline, I suppose, in the last 30 years, 20 years. And that's the main focus of the talk. And I know this intersects with some of your interests. I'll give you some sort of background about it at the beginning, just to give you a sense of how it fits into various contexts. But for my sins, which are manifold and various, my day job is in an English department. So inevitably, I come at these questions from a certain angle. And it's an angle that I myself have a rather angular relationship to. And one of them is actually via the history of the book, to be slightly angular to my own subject. So I found the history of the book a great outlet for certain questions I had about my own discipline. But inevitably, in my home discipline, my salary-paying discipline is probably the more accurate description of it, is the question of reading is at the forefront of it. And we're all involved in reading in one way or another, whatever you're doing. But so I thought I would at least start there. And partly by way of just a prologue to all of this, but also to make this a little event, a modestly multimedia event. What I thought I'd do is begin by performing the everyday conjuring trick of translating these visual marks that you see here, which are a pixelated version, as you're looking at it now. So you can see this is now already heading towards being digital and oral. A pixelated version of the Latin alphabet. I'm going to translate those marks into sounds. Of course, this is what we far too casually call reading aloud. But it's an everyday miracle. And I'm going to do it. The bus had come to a stop. Its confused rattle had given place to an endless spastic shudder, as if its pieces were held together by too much rust ever to fall completely apart. The driver climbed down onto the road from his seat, took a crumpled packet of Tuskers from his shirt pocket, stuck a bent cigarette in his mouth, and lit a match. So at the risk of making you feel that you are now in some other disciplinary context, and even worse, in some other geographical context and historical context, namely Cambridge, England in the 1920s, and taking part in one of the literary critic and theorists called I.A. Richards, one of his dubious reading experiments, I'd like you not just to keep the look and sound of these words in mind as I talk today, but to consider the forms of recognition that you bring to them at this point, at this moment. Perhaps you know their provenance and authorship, and I know two people in this room do. Perhaps you simply have a hunch about the mode of writing to which they belong, or perhaps you have some other initial thoughts. All options at this point are open. But what I'd like to do today is to take a circuitous route back to these words with a view to explaining why, given your first responses, the responses that if you just think about what's going through your mind now, why such routes, such circuitous routes might be worth taking in the first place. Okay, I'm now going to leave that to one side. As I said, this is about thinking about disciplinary issues, intellectual disciplinary issues. And if we trace the birth of the history of the book as a discipline to any single year, if we can do that, then 1982 is probably the most serious contender, the beginning of that discipline. That year saw the appearance of the first volume, and this is for Adrienne's sake, of course, and Dostin's sake, no doubt, of the Histoire de l'édition française, and the publication of Robert Darnton's manifesto essay entitled What is the History of Books? Over the past 30 years, the field has established itself, as Darnton predicted, and these are his words from that essay, alongside fields like the history of science and the history of art in the canon, he said, of scholarly disciplines. In the process, it has reshaped many traditional subjects in the humanities and the social sciences. And this is where it might intersect with your own interests and work. Among other things, it has encouraged historians to see books themselves not just as indices, but as agents of historical change in societies as diverse as France in the 1780s and India in the 1920s. It has fostered a greater awareness among literary scholars and, I would say, linguists of the materiality of the book as a medium and of the institutions in which acts of writing and reading take place. It has led social scientists to analyze the publishing industry as an intricately structured, evolving world of its own, albeit one linked in complex ways to the larger forces at work in social, economic and political history. It has even made inroads into the otherwise rarefied world of philosophy, where it has prompted reflection on the consequences for humanity of the emergence of a new multimedia age in which a paperless and almost borderless future is at least imaginable, if not imminent. As is the case with any new discipline, the emergence of what is now called book history studies was not quite as straightforward as this sketch suggests. At one level, this was inevitable. Far from simply seeking a place in what Darnton called the canon of scholarly disciplines, a new form of inquiry, if it's worth taking seriously, will always unsettle traditional ways of thinking and challenge previously clear, often vigorously defended disciplinary boundaries. This is especially true if its primary object, the book in this case, has long been declared the property of more established scholarly disciplines. At another level, however, the unease this new discipline sometimes caused was less predictable. To begin with, there were the difficulties of the name itself. Book history, as the editors of the journal, there's a key kind of scholarly journal for the field that emerged in the 1990s, Book History, as the editors of this journal, with the title Book History, resignedly remarked in their inaugural volume in 1998, Book History, they said, is the least satisfactory name for this scholarly frontier, which is certainly not limited to books or to histories. Rather, they said, its field of play is in the entire history of written communication. The creation, these are their words, creation, dissemination and uses of script and print in any medium, including books, newspapers, periodicals, manuscripts and ephemera. That's 1998. Expansive as it was, this formulation cut two ways. On the one hand, it opened up the question of the relations, which is maybe particularly important in this context in South Africa, between oral and written forms of communication, which have always remained inextricably entangled, no matter what context you look at it. On the other hand, for a claim made in the late 1990s, it oddly left digital modes out of the equation altogether. That the editors concluded their introduction with, they said, the promise that their journal, and this is what they said again in their inaugural volume, would change the way we read words on paper, only complicated this last problem. So given these methodological quandaries, it might be better to see the field, as I see it at least, as involving the study of communications across all linguistic media: oral, manuscript, print, and digital. Yet the term book stuck for a reason that had much to do with the particular circumstances out of which the discipline emerged in the 1980s and the methodological assumptions against which it was initially defined at that point. So the term book has in a sense become a kind of metonymy for the whole thing, for any medium of communication, effectively what happened. For many of the early champions of the field, its distinctiveness lay primarily in the scrupulous attention it brought to bear on the material history of all media, which more established disciplines, they claimed, largely ignored. As the editors of Book History again observed, historians, they said, have always relied on documents to reconstruct the past, and perhaps for that reason they overlooked, until very recently, the history of documents themselves. Arguing against a purely semantic definition of the text, in a seminal essay of 1992, Adrien will appreciate this, the French book historian Roger Chartier similarly insisted, he said, that readers in fact never confront abstract, idealized texts detached from any materiality. Rather, this is still Chartier, they hold in their hands or perceive objects and forms whose structures and modalities govern their reading or hearing. Absolutely. At that point, I'm not sure. The translation from French, the word govern in English, seems to me a little overly emphatic. Most readers that I know are a little bit freer of what they've got from what they've got holding, or that they're holding in their hands. Anyway, characteristically, in making this claim, Chartier was concerned not just to correct the quantitative methods of the Annales school of French book history, against which he defined his own more qualitative approach in the 1980s, but what he took to be the neo-conceptions of text associated with French theory and literary studies at that point. A comparable anti-Platonic drive can be seen in D.F. Mackenzie's arguments against traditional forms of bibliography in favor of what Mackenzie called the sociology of texts. This is in the famous series of Panizzi lectures that he gave in the mid-1990s in the British Library, called Bibliography and the Sociology of Text. Bringing the documentary medium, which had previously been neglected in favor of its context, to the fore was, in other words, integral to the new discipline's bid for scholarly recognition. That whole thing about being part of the canon of scholarly disciplines in Danton's sense. Hence the appeal of the term book, the most iconic document in the West, which if used metonymically, or metonymically as they thought, could be said to stand for all media. Okay, I think for all its strategic value, the early emphasis on the materiality of the book or the document in this sense had a number of unhappy methodological consequences. For one thing, it fostered countless case studies, all of which relentlessly reiterated the basic materialist or new documentalist point, albeit across a wide range of periods and contexts. For another, the focus on transforming the way we read words on paper. You might be now again beginning to appreciate why I started with this oral rendition of a digital text. The way we read words on paper privileged questions of reception, often at the expense of the other stages in the communicative process. Somewhat perversely, given the anti-Platonic ambitions driving the emergence of book history, this had the effect of turning the book or the document into a kind of materialist fetish, which was, from a methodological point of view, almost as abstract as the orthodox literary critic's text. It was as if the book itself, rather than the relations and questions it opened up, became the object of study. This particular risk, it's worth recalling, had been anticipated, not least in Danton's founding essay of 1982. His communication circuit, which unfortunately I don't have an image of, but it's a circuit that tries to map the entire process of book production, dissemination and reception, focusing primarily on the agents involved and the agencies involved in that process, from writers to printers to publishers to librarians, etc., everybody involved in the process. So his communication circuit, which is a model of showing how all the agents are involved in the creation, dissemination, reception of books, relate to each other, was intended precisely to preempt narrow specialization. This is Danton in 1982. Some holistic view of the book as a means of communication, he argued, seems necessary if book history is to avoid being fragmented, he then said, into esoteric specializations, cut off from each other by arcane techniques and mutual misunderstanding. Having sketched the various points on his circuit, which ran in a loop from the author to the reader via the publisher and the bookseller, Danton added that book history concerns itself with each phase of this process and the process as a whole, in all its variations over time and space, and in all its relation to other systems, economic, political, and cultural, in the surrounding environment. For me, reclaiming Danton's ambitious holism is essential as we contemplate the future of the discipline today, as indeed I think is Danton's internationalism, a point that I'm going to return to at the end. But to get a clearer sense of the stakes involved, I'd like first to consider another, in some ways slightly in terms of the history of the book, certainly as a discipline, a less well-known context in which an idea for a holistic study of the book arose more or less simultaneously with Danton's own. And this surprisingly takes us to UCT in 1980. In 1980, J.M. Coetzee, who was then a lecturer in English at the University of Cape Town, offered a course called The Book in Africa as a specialist first-year undergraduate option on the university's new African literature program. As he made clear in the prospectus for this course, it was a novel undertaking that confronted some of the limitations of literary studies at that point in time. This is what he said in the prospectus. So this is for people who want to sign up to this option, students. We will be exploring some of the determinants of literary production not dealt with in literary study, 1980. Environmental pressures of all kinds on writers, the economics of publishing and distributing literary works, the nature of the readership of literary works. Since much of the information required for this kind of study, you can see him maybe slightly wanting to put people off at this point, study is not readily available, students are forewarned that the course will entail a certain amount of bibliographical ferreting and a certain amount of practical investigative research. A shocking thing for students of literature in the 1980s probably to contemplate. Though Coetzee conceived of the course after reading Elizabeth Eisenstein's The Printing Press as an Agent of Change, which was first published in 1979, he had not been following the rise of book history as such, as a discipline. He just was inspired by that book. His extensive reading list included Richard D. Alteck's The English Common Reader from 1957, Robert Escarpet's The Book Revolution from 1966, and John Sutherland's Fiction and the Fiction Industry from 1978, all of which made important, though indirect, contributions to the new field, but he did not cite the work, he didn't even cite Eisenstein in the actual prospectus. I just found out later that that was the book that inspired him. He didn't cite any of the more self-consciously pioneering book historians of the 1960s and 70s, such as Roger Chartier, Robert Danton, Lucien Febvre, Henri-Jean Martin, D.F. Mackenzie, or indeed Eisenstein herself. Instead, he directed his students to the field via a series of questions he had concerning the predicament of African writers in the second half of the 20th century. His reading list gave special prominence to essays by, among others, Chinua Achebe, Ali Mazrui, Eskian Pahlele, Ngugi wa Thiong'o, Emmanuel Obachina, and Wole Soyinka. Looked at from the perspective of this generation of African writers, it was impossible, Coetzee suggested, to see the book itself merely as a neutral medium. Given the history of its advent during the era of European colonization and its role as an agent for change in post-colonial Africa, it had to be seen as a culturally freighted artifact in its own right. This downplayed the influence of Islamic scribal culture, which more recent scholarship has shown spread into sub-Saharan Africa in the course of the 13th century, but it nonetheless remains the case that the arrival of the book and eventually of the printing press from Europe after the 15th century represented a decisive event for African cultures in which the performing and visual arts, music and varieties of orature constituted the traditionally dominant expressive media. In Coetzee's view, the consequences of this were not just cultural or political. If we accept, he said, following in particular the other people he'd been reading at this place were Walter Ong, Marshall McLuhan, and Jack Goody, the main theorists of oral cultures at that point. So if we accept, following Ong, McLuhan, and Goody, said Coetzee, that print changes modes of thought, these are comments coming, by the way, in the incredibly detailed preparatory notes that he made for this course. Coetzee, I think, puts most of us to shame as academics in terms of his level of preparation for the courses that he taught, all of which now survive in NELM, in Grahamstown, his course preparation. Just reading, most of the courses that he prepared, I'm sure one day they will be published because they are publishable in terms of the level of articulation and detail, scriptedness of what he was going to do. It's quite remarkable. So these are just handwritten notes preparing for the course. He says, if we accept the print changes mode following McLuhan, Goody, etc., the print changes modes of thought, then printing can be seen as the agent whereby the world is modernized. echoing Marshall McLuhan's arguments in Understanding Media, the Extensions of Man, one of kind of McLuhan's more textbook-like interventions, which appeared in 1964. Coetzee added that it is the print quality of the artifact, not the content, the medium rather than the message, that is of prime importance if we're thinking about this changing of modes of thought. Yet to understand this, and so to grasp the full implications of taking the book as an object of study in itself, it was essential to attend not just to the history of its advent in Africa, or, he then said again in these notes, to mundane social factors in the study of the growth of the reading habit, for example, availability of light, or the seating space on trains. Having just taken the Gau train, we can now see that is designed to be able to read on a train. It was necessary, Coetzee said, to analyze, and these are again his words, the class structure of the so-called emergent African nations, and above all, the place of the intelligentsia in that structure. Since this particular social faction was, he said, the prime modernizing agent for whom newspapers, periodicals, and books of all kinds were the essential media. As a number of scholars are pointing out and have done for a number of years, this of course goes way back into the 19th century. First of all, the colonial African elite and then the post-colonial African elite taking over those media. So this line of inquiry, which took the publishing industry as its starting point, raised a number of pressing questions for students of African literature. Coetzee said, and this is again from his notes, as long as African writers remain bound to a supranational, he said, system of publication in the broadest sense, the old splits in consciousness, again these are in his notes, which may or may not aid production, again a crucially sort of skeptical claim, will persist. Writing for a national audience, said Coetzee, versus, so these are the issues facing African writers, he's claiming, writing for a national audience versus writing for an international audience. Writing to foster nationalist values versus writing to foster internationalist values. The values, he then said, of the international intelligentsia. Writing after African models versus writing after metropolitan models. Writing by African standards versus writing by metropolitan standards. Making the book the initial point of departure was not only relevant for aspiring Africanists, however, it also opened up some key methodological questions for literary students in general, Coetzee said. As he remarked, the course proposed, and this is again in his notes, that, and remember Darnton's communications circuit at this point, which he hadn't, that came out in 82, so this is 1980, that the unit of historical meaning, this is Coetzee's preparatory notes again, his words, the unit of historical meaning is not who writes what at what time, but that at a certain time someone should write X, someone should publish it, someone should bring it to the attention of readers, and someone should read it. That's the unit, not the text, but that whole sequence. The primary object, he said, was the complete act of transmission. For literary students or scholars for that matter, schooled in one or another tradition of close reading, again you can see my own disciplinary background coming out here, who considered the words on the page, or on paper as we heard earlier, to be their chief concern, this entailed a radical shift of orientation. From this point of view, Coetzee continued, it is not the publishing industry in isolation that must be examined, and certainly not the activity of writing or texts in isolation, but the total industry that involves, and again his formulations are interesting, the sponsorship of texts, in part by the creation of a climate, in part by educational processes, the dissemination of texts, publishing, distribution, selling, and lending, and the criticism of texts. So, sponsorship, dissemination, criticism, all of those things. Again, you can see him coming primarily from a literary point of view, orienting this towards literary students in the 1980s. So for those students, Coetzee's emphasis on the total industry and his effort to displace attention away from the activity of writing was as challengingly novel as it was demanding. In addition to acquiring some expertise in a wide range of disciplines, including literary criticism, sociology, cognitive psychology, cultural history, politics, and economics, he expected his students to have a firm grounding in what would now be called book history, and to develop an appreciation of its relevance to African studies and humanistic scholarship generally. Among other things, he encouraged students to investigate, and these are possible research tasks that he's now setting for them in the prospectus. These are again his words. The location of bookstores in the Cape Peninsula and the types of clientele they serve. So remember, this is 1980 in South Africa. The library services in the black residential areas of the Cape. Go and study those. And the histories and editorial policies of a number of South African literary magazines of the 1960s and 1970s, from Purple Rhinoster to Contrast to the South Rider and Izwi and many others. In addition, he suggested that they might consider which works by black South African writers the apartheid censors tended to proscribe and which ones they let through. The origin and development, he said, another topic, of the Heinemann African Writers series. And given the emphasis he placed on South and West African contexts, he suggested that students might compare and contrast, this is one of my favorites, compare and contrast Onitsha market literature from Nigeria with the South African fotoroman, or photo novel, I guess would be the translation, in terms of themes and readership. Everybody remember the fotoroman. There's actually somebody has, in Andrew van der Vlies's new volume, there's somebody's written an article on that, which is great, that the fotoroman is making a comeback. So given all the ferreting that was involved in this, not to mention the fact that the course tested the limits of literary studies in the 1980s, it's perhaps unsurprising that it was not a success. Though the University of Cape Town's very embattled African literature program continued, Coetzee's Book in Africa option attracted few takers, and it was shelved after 1 year. I think thanks largely to the impact of the book histories had on literary studies and other disciplines within humanities more broadly over the past 30 years, it's hard to imagine Coetzee's course meeting with a similar response today. And I've just sort of proven this to myself by I've been teaching a methodological course for master students at UCT, and I've had a regular audience of 25 people for broadly a book historical approach to literary studies, and they've kept coming. So it hasn't been an utter disaster in a way that Coetzee's. One of the things is particularly when you see all the effort that he put into preparing for it, and he actually claimed that one student took it for 1 year. That was the outcome. Anyway, so at the same time, I don't think it would have that kind of impact today because of book histories, the rise of book history. I think at the same time, its daunting scope, which at various points mirrors the equally ambitious research agenda that Darnton set in 1982, raises a number of questions about the future direction of the discipline, which, given the way it's developed, now pose, I think, as much of a challenge to book history itself as anything else. I think both Coetzee and Darnton would ask questions about what people are doing under this now rather capacious umbrella term book history today. I think, like Darnton, Coetzee recognized the danger of isolating any one aspect of the book at the expense of the others. Just as Darnton proposed his communication circuit in an effort to prevent the new discipline from fragmenting into a series of unconnected specializations, so Coetzee wanted his students to treat the total industry as their primary object. I think developing this more capacious analytical framework remained indispensable for the future, partly because it might help to restrain the proliferation of case studies, which have kind of defined the field certainly in the last decade, but mainly because it constitutes a precondition for understanding how the parts relate to each other and the whole. To make sense of any particular activity, publishing for instance, it's necessary not only to grasp how the circuit at any one time works as an interrelated system, which is also embedded in larger social, technological, economic and political systems, but to recognize that publishers themselves act in terms of their own, I'll borrow that Geertzian term, thick, which doesn't mean stupid, but densely informed and often highly mobile understanding of the whole. So they're often, the individual decisions that they made are often, it's what Pierre Bourdieu calls a sens pratique, a really practical knowledge that they've developed over years, that they will inform every single decision that they're making, but it will inform how, it's based on their understanding of how the whole network is operating at any one time. I think John B. Thompson's book, which came out in 2010, called Merchants of Culture, which is as much a socio-economic analysis of the publishing business at the beginning of the new century, of the 21st century, as it is a quasi-ethnographic study of publishers. I think it's exemplary in that regard, trying to show how publishers operate with a sense of the whole. So to illustrate the importance of keeping this thick understanding of the total industry in the frame, I'd like to turn briefly to James Curry's recent account of the fluctuating fortunes of the Heinemann African Writers series, or AWS as I call it, from its inception in 1962 to the late 1980s. Describing the selection of any new title for that series, Curry recalls, this is in his book called Africa Writes Back, which came out in 2011, if I remember rightly. It's his kind of publisher's, his own take on the incredibly rich Heinemann African Writers archive. He's going back over it as the publisher and giving you a kind of an insider's history of the series. So, describing the selection of any new title for that series as a publisher, Curry recalls that while the initial discussion was always literary, the decision to publish had, he said, to reflect practical and political realities, most notably relating to what he said, in his words, the economics of the firm and the publishing industry at the time, which, for a series like AWS, the African Writers series, had everything to do with changing educational policies and resources rather than with the vagaries of commercial bookselling. I think this is something we always tend to underestimate, is a huge proportion of the book world operates outside of the commercial market. It's operating with where other major institutions, for instance, are its consumers. In particular, prescribed books for schools and universities is probably the most important. I know this is an area that Beth is interested in. So billed as a modern literary imprint fashioned by Africans for Africa and modelled on the success of Penguin in the UK, the low-cost paperback series in fact began as a highly successful exercise in rebranding by a colonial educational publisher created by editors in London, Ibadan and Nairobi for, in the first instance, secondary schools and universities in Anglophone Africa. Unlike the popular, often fictionalized educational pamphlets that were produced locally in Nigeria and sold directly to readers via market stalls in towns like Onitsha, AWS initially flourished as an elite-sponsored, supranational collaboration between a British-based commercial publisher and selected post-colonial African states, or more accurately, government education departments. Following the wider economic crises of the early 1980s, however, Curry and his colleagues were obliged to shift their attention to the UK and the US, where coincidentally, the advent of a multicultural approach to education created new opportunities that ensured the ongoing survival of the series just as the African market began to shrink. He actually recalls containers of African Writers series books being scrapped in the harbour, pulped in the harbour in Lagos and in Ibadan, and just being because they couldn't because of the economic crisis of the early 1980s, they could no longer be bought. So taking the complete act of transmission as the unit of historical meaning, then we need to acknowledge not just that Chinua Achebe wrote Things Fall Apart in the mid-1950s, but that Heinemann published it, Things Fall Apart, as the inaugural African Writers series volume in 1962, that African educators prescribed it for schools and universities, that a generation of African students consequently studied it, and one of the things that I'm doing for another project I'm doing is these are once you've got that built-in market of an educational market. I mean, the second-hand book market is full of those prescribed books that are now available with detailed student annotations, which are normally them making notes on their copies that they're reading at school. So, and you get an incredible insight into how they thought about what they were reading and also how they were being taught to read. And of course, you can also go into the archives of the government education departments where they survive, and you can see what the thinking was behind that relationship with African Writers series. So we can look at the students and how they read it, and that after the economic crises of the 1980s, the book began, say, this is true of certainly of Things Fall Apart, an entirely new life as part of a very different communication circuit outside of Africa, particularly in the US and the UK. We also need to acknowledge that every single decision that Curry and his colleagues took as publishers, from the selection of titles to the details of format and presentation, was affected by their own understanding of how these disparate and shifting circuits worked as integrated systems. Again, we can't separate out the publisher from the whole thing. I think the other key point of convergence between Coetzee's understanding of the book in Africa and Darnton's vision for book history in 1982 relates to their internationalism, which, given their respective points of reference, they conceived in different terms. I think this also speaks to the future of the discipline. Challenging the founding assumptions on which various national histories of the book were beginning to be established at the time, and I know this is something that has haunted the discussions in South Africa amongst various colleagues here, the model of the national history of the book, which started with the Histoire de l'édition française in the 1980s. So challenging those founding assumptions, Darnton insisted that, these are his words again in that 1982 essay, books do not respect limits either linguistic or national. They have often been written by authors who belonged to an international republic of letters. You can there see that he's a scholar of France in the 18th century. Le République des Lettres, etc. Composed by printers who did not work in their native tongue, sold by booksellers who operated across national borders, and read in one language by readers who spoke another. As his own formulation suggests, Darnton had in mind the ideals of the 18th century République des Lettres in Europe and America, but as Coetzee recognized, it was just as difficult to make the book in 20th century Africa part of a historical narrative defined in national terms, albeit for different reasons. While many Anglophone African writers contributed willingly or testedly, as we'll see, to a post-colonial project of nation building, they also depended heavily on what Coetzee called a supranational system of publication dating from the colonial era that was either specifically Pan-African or more broadly Commonwealth. And this has specifically to do with how, if we take it after 1947 in particular, how copyright territories, legal copyright territories were defined and split up really by English language publishers between the US and the UK, primarily London and New York, after 47, creating the kind of system of copyright that still, despite various things that have changed, still kind of hovers in the background with every book that's published. Despite the political developments of the 1960s, this legacy was perpetuated in the immediate post-colonial era under what was called the Traditional Markets Agreement, which divided the Anglophone world into two protected trading zones, one British and the other American. When this informal agreement collapsed after a court case in the mid-1970s, resulting in a more fluid arrangement of so-called open and closed markets in terms of rights distributions, the mismatch between legally agreed rights territories and politically defined national boundaries became, if anything, more acute. So book worlds are mapped completely different to political worlds. As always, this has particular significance for works originally written in English. The mismatch is less pronounced when it comes to the world's smaller languages, many of which continue to be contained within without necessarily being coextensive with national borders. You think of Isiposa publications or Afrikaans and so on and so forth, or Norwegian for that matter. Reclaiming the holistic and internationalist ambitions Darnton and Coetzee set in the 1980s, I think remains a central task for book history in the years ahead. Moving on from the evangelical materialism that dominated the discipline during its pioneering phase and reconnecting the history of the book to the history of thought is, in my view, no less urgent. And this is the final point I wanted to make, is that I think in some ways there has been a kind of evangelical materialist claim we all need to come back to the fact that things are in documents, in books, or in readers' hands, or whatever it is. We need to be aware of the medium. I think sometimes that has gone with a sometimes debilitating, certainly limiting disconnect from the history of thought or the history of ideas in general. And I think to this end we could do well to start by recalling that the communication circuit is always about something more than the material and now digital material processes of book production and diffusion. In producing specific kinds of document for particular markets or communities of readers, publishers, typesetters and booksellers also shape public space in ways that can be best described as performative. And here I'm borrowing this term from speech act theory. Performative in the sense of it's an act that will be as creative and shaping as a authorized minister declaring, I now declare you husband and wife, which then transforms the reality of the couple that's in front of him, once that's said. To see this element of performativity at work, I think I'd like to return to the African Writers series just by way of conclusion, and just consider the use of the word African in that title series. Always eager to prevent the term from being racialized, Heinemann, especially under Curry's direction, which was until the mid-1980s, intended it to describe the writer's geographical origins, but through the cumulative effect of the day-to-day editorial decisions, it quickly acquired a deeper literary significance and intellectual significance as well. So it's not just geographical, it's also intellectual. AWS titles were not just by writers from Africa. They were powerful exemplars of modern African writing, at least in the sense in which the publishers sought to fashion that category at that moment. Curry worried, for instance, if you look at the archives, one of the things that why I think archival research is so essential for all of this is that in libraries, what we will have, ideally, where we have comprehensive collections that have survived, we will have what they chose, the titles they chose. In the archive, in order to understand something about the titles that they chose, you need to see all the titles they rejected. And they're not always rejected simply on grounds of, if you like, literary merit, as in, you know, this is too juvenile or whatever, this kind of writing is not what we want to support. Curry worried, for instance, that Bessie Head's disturbing study of racism and madness, a question of power, which they did eventually publish in 1974, was not, he said, this is in a letter to Bessie Head, was not, he said, rarely African, but more, and these are his words again, more closely related to the mainstream of Anglo-American internal writing, he said. In other words, turned inward. Though he eventually took it on as something of an experiment, he said, for the African market, he turned down J.M. Coetzee's debut, Dusklands, which was arguably even less African on Curry's terms at that point. By contrast, Aikwe Amar's first novel, The Beautiful Ones Are Not Yet Born, which appeared first in 1969, one of the most successful titles in the series, seemed ideally suited to the AWS project, and this was a point that Heinemann underscored through various presentational devices. So this brings me back to my opening quotation, which you can now see is a digitized facsimile version of the first few sentences of Aikwe Amar's The Beautiful Ones Are Not Yet Born, which you can here see in my undergraduate marked up version from the mid-1980s. That's a facsimile of no longer the digital version that you had. This is one of the things I think that's essential about book history, is you want to be very precise about exactly what medium you're seeing this in. So what do you get to see here that you didn't get to see here is the question to ask. Well, once we start to do this, then of course you realize that we don't ever encounter these words in that form in the old medium of print, which will go on for many years to come. We encounter it in that form, not quite of course, that is still a digital facsimile of a paper-supported version. But of course, you have to work your way through, in any book, an elaborate series of what we can call paratextual porticoes, the first of which is the title page. One of the things to note again, nothing is insignificant Nothing is non-significant. Everything signifies, including the colour. Does anybody want to hazard a guess as to what Heinemann and Curry and so on were alluding to simply by the choice of colour? And in particular, it's orange. That is like, you won't see it here, but the spine is orange, and the back is orange. And you've got that kind of flower arrangement, which could also be an eye, but it's various things on the cover. Anybody want to hazard a guess as to why it was orange?
Nothing to do with the Dutch, is it?
I'm wondering, would it be to symbolise clay, or is it to say take it as seriously as Penguin edition?
Exactly. Not necessarily take it as seriously as, but see it as the African version of the paperback revolution that Penguin initiated in the 1930s in the UK. This is the Penguin paperback revolution for Africa. So they chose orange to allude to that. So again, that was not innocent. The other thing that's not innocent is that here you'll see this is the 1984, not the 1969 edition, and you can see the reorientation of the market by simply putting the New York Times quote on the top, on that cover. So now they are no longer trying to flog this book in Africa, they're trying to sell it in the US. And they sold it very successfully there. But we go through a whole series of these things. The most important thing in terms of any series, of course, which is another way of encountering, is it will have this kind of meta-series dimension to it in terms of presentation, and you will have it identified as a particular number in this whole series, where we'll see everything from Peter Abrahams to Yolisa Madi at the bottom. A numbered series, which is the Heinemann African Writers series as evolving. So you can't encounter those words without a whole series of other things being drawn into that and bringing you to that. Of course, you'll have a title page, which is important in a number of respects. Perhaps one of the things going on here is simply the genre question. It's a novel, and it's telling you that it's a novel right from the get-go. Wants to make that a key aspect of how you think about it. When you get to a writer like someone like Coetzee or somebody like that, even that's problematic. If a publisher calls what he's doing a novel, he's not necessarily writing novels. It doesn't seem so. But of course, the other thing is you've got Heinemann. You've got the colonial allusion in the HEB, Heinemann Educational Books. That's the mother company, as it were, of which African Writer Series was actually trying to break away from it, and was in many ways an independent formation. But you've got also very clearly highlighted the three homes of the publisher. This is important also in terms of geography: London, Ibadan, Nairobi. That's the publishing house. Because if we go over, we then get all the printing and production details, and you'll see there, this is true right the way back to the 1960s. 1968 copyright, but first published in that's because of the hardback edition, by the way, which is published separately. But immediately the paperback comes out 1969, first published in African Writers 1969, but there you can see the success of it right the way through until 1979, being regularly reprinted. And then this is the 1984 edition, so then it still takes off, but they ship. But the key thing there is you notice that the book is printed and produced in Britain. So again, in terms of studying that history. The other things that you'll see is, of course, it'll have a back cover, and there you can see the orange very conspicuously. You can see this is true. This is my Rhodes undergraduate years. It was bought at university publishers and booksellers, Grahamstown, for a mere £5.45, I think it is. In those days. But there you'll get a whole series of things to do with the biography, and you'll see a number of things, again, an object of study in itself, the blurbs, the blurb and the puffs that they're putting on the back. Really something that's worth studying in and of itself. So the blurbs at the back, again, we think about the market that's now being oriented here in the mid-1980s, are taken from British newspaper reviews. And they draw attention it's again, what is the publisher using the reviews to do to present the book in a certain way? And what we see is that, first of all, they draw attention to the novel's topical themes, describing it as a story of an upright man resisting the temptations of easy bribes and easy satisfactions, these are on the back cover, and identifying it generically as a clever and uncomfortable moral fable. In addition, the inside pages of a later edition of this 1984, this is on the back, on the inside page, they advertised the novels of IFAS-Research, which appeared in 1980, a critical study by Robert Fraser, which is also published by Heinemann. As the advertisement noted, Amar in this study emerges from this account as a committed artist attempting to clear the path of cultural reconstruction by means of a dynamic philosophy of history. That's a general claim from the blurb for this critical study. Of course, as you start to get into the archives and work out who these people are, what are the connections, Fraser, as it happens, was also a key editorial advisor for the series. What Heinemann saw itself as doing in the 1960s and 70s then was creating a space within the territories defined by their rights agreements for writing that was African insofar as it addressed urgent historical questions in a realistic way and was committed, in Sartre's charged sense of that term, to the post-colonial project of reconstruction. That is, if we connect up all of this ultimately to the history of ideas and the history of thought, that is the kind of the meaning that they wanted to build up through their series, through a number of volumes, for the term African beyond its geographical reference. A similar analysis would of course be needed at all the other points in the circuit, since every agent has the opportunity to reframe the book, or any book, in her or his own terms, in the course of enabling its onward transmission. Think about how people might set this up in terms of a course that's being taught and so on and so forth. In the case of Amar's novel, for instance, we would need to consider not just which reviewers and critics read it, and how they did so, and where they published their reviews, and how they appeared, but how African syllabus designers saw it as fitting in with their educational objectives at the time, in the 60s and 70s. Prescribing a book is, after all, no less a performative act, subject to a number of institutional conditions than publishing or reviewing. To complete the circuit, at least in this African version, we would also need to establish how African students themselves read it. Developing an analysis of this kind, I think, would be critical for two reasons. First, it makes it possible to track the performative effects of production, diffusion, and sponsorship, the total industry, on the history of thought. And second, it allows us to return to the activity of writing, which, following Danton and Coetzee, remains in the picture, though no longer as its focal point. This return is necessary in part because we need, as Danton argued, to understand the nature of a literary career and how it was pursued, and how writers deal with publishers, printers, booksellers, reviewers, and one another. It is also, as Coetzee acknowledged, because we need to recognize that these so-called contextual factors do not simply form the background to any act of writing or speaking. Whether serving as a spur or as a constraint, they constitute its institutional conditions of possibility, and as a consequence become internalized as part of the inner drama of expression. So these things are not simply outside, I don't think, the activity of writing or the history of thought, they're also inside it. As long as African writers remain bound to a supranational system of publication, as Coetzee put it, the old splits in consciousness, which may or may not aid production, will persist. Amar's own strained relations with Heinemann show just how fraught these potentially creative self-divisions can be. Accepting the manuscript for The Beautiful Ones in 1967 was, according to Curry in his memoirs, the beginning of by far and away the worst relationship we ever experienced with an author. Giving his side of the story a few years later, Amar recalled his struggle, these are Amar's words, to find an African publisher as opposed to a neo-colonial, listen to his words, a neo-colonial writer's coffle, owned by Europeans but slyly misnamed African. Okay, coffle is the slave chain. This acerbic testimony, which is by no means unusual in the history of publishing, whether in Africa or elsewhere, confirms, I think, the performative power of the publishing process and opens up a series of who's naming me African, into which system am I being absorbed as a writer, what does that mean? Aikwe Alma had very strong views on that. Of course, Achebe was involved in this, and he had other views on that process, so it's conflicted, it's not straightforward, but it's there. So it opens up a series of challenging questions about the role of publishers, not just as merchants, but as sponsors of culture. In my view, it also obliges us to go back to the text of the Beautiful Ones itself, not to contemplate it in its splendid isolation, but to reassess its relationship as an intervention in the history of thought to the larger project of African writing to which Heinemann and various other educational institutes in Africa and elsewhere were committed. Looking again at the words with which I started, in their digitized facsimile version, I'll simply point out that Armand's opening description, with its pointed though understated reference to Chinua Achebe's founding novel, Things Fall Apart, asks to be read not just as a powerful exercise in committed realism or as a moral fable, but as a testy, self-conscious contribution to the series and to the ongoing literary debate about the question of writing Africa that it represented. There is more than one level of significance at work, I think, in the fact that it is as if, says Amar, the rust that holds his rickety bust together, it is as if the rust holds the bust together, keeping it from falling apart. As if the rust. Such a return, I think, to the text is essential, I would argue, not because the future of book history depends on its capacity to change how we read and listen, but because book historians who ignore the performative effects of speech and writing risk looking like art historians who have abandoned any interest in pictures in order to concentrate on the history of frames, or historians of science who are more eager to study the sociology of laboratories than the meaning of scientific discoveries. Thanks very much.